Hello. Hi, Ahmed. Hi, Farrukh. Good evening, everyone. My name is Monia Chari, and I would like to welcome you, everyone, to this lovely evening, which is, I'm just going to say this at the very beginning, is going to be a very relaxed evening and very relaxed chat about the Peacock screen. Before introducing my guest, as said, my name is Monia. I'm an associate professor in film studies at the Montfort Universities, and I work on Indian cinema, and I'm interested in ways in which Indian cinema was mobilized outside India, so the kind of international circulation of Indian cinema, broadly speaking. Before introducing further Ahmed and Farrukh, I just would like to mention that before meeting with everyone this evening, we agreed to dedicate this evening to a very dear friend to all of us. This evening is, and this talk, this conversation is dedicated to Mahmoud Jamal. Mahmoud was, if I want to say just a few words, Mahmoud was a pioneering producer of film and programs pertaining to South Asian culture and British Asian communities. He was one of the most poignant voices of multicultural television in Britain. The launch of Channel 4 in 1982 and the commitment to feature programs otherwise less exposed to BBC and ITV led Mahmoud and his brother Ahmed, who is here with us tonight, to form the All Asian Retake Film and Video Collective. A few years later, Mahmoud then formed his own production company, Epic Flow, and he began making film set in and of interest to British Asian communities. And among among his work produced with Epic Flow, we had the Peacock screen. I really wanted to mention this, and I wanted to say that this is a celebration of this evening is a celebration of Mahmoud's work. With us we have Ahmed Jamal. Ahmed is brother of Mahmoud. Ahmed is again, he's a huge name, and I can't really say enough, but he's a very established film and documentary maker, studied filmmaking at London Film School, and he's a film director and producer. His company, First Take Ltd, has produced programs for, just to mention a few, BBC, Channel 4, HBO, CNN, and other international broadcasters. Allow me to introduce Farrukh as well. Farrukh is our Farrukh Dhondy. He's now a very good friend, I'd say. We had very interesting conversation on Indian cinema in the past few months. And Farrukh is, he's a former Channel 4 commissioning editor for multicultural programming. He became responsible for developing Black and Asian independent production. Capitalizing on the available budget to air Indian cinema in Channel 4, Farrukh screened also classic from his childhood in India. He pioneered the commissioning and broadcasting of international Indian cinema, such as, just a few titles, I'm sure you're all familiar with Salam Bombay, Electric Moon, and Mississippi Masala. Farrukh has been a very prolific writer as well, script writer, and he was a writer and producer. And again, just to mention, just a very popular title, he produced Shekhar Kapoor's Bandit Queen as well. With Mahmoud, he's been working on several projects, among which we had the project, the Peacock screen, for which he was commissioning editor. I could say a lot more. They have incredibly interesting lives and experiences, but I would rather start talking to them about the Peacock screen, which is a beautiful program which was hired in the 90s by Channel 4. This program was based on a lot of the work done by Mahmoud. A lot of interviews done by Mahmoud. His collection is now has about is formed of about 90 interviews, and I just would like to mention that in the past months we have been working together to try and find a way to digitize this collection so that we can home it here at DMU and make it available for communities, for researchers, and so on, because it's an invaluable source of knowledge on Indian cinema. So without going on chatting, I would like to leave I would like to start having our conversation with Farrukh and Ahmed. And I would like to ask a little bit more about the Peacock screen and kind of trying to understand a bit the creative process. So what made you think about we should have something about Indian cinema on Channel 4?
Well, having been a commissioning editor for several years, we had featured every year at least 26 films a year of Indian cinema. And we would show them at times when the general audience wouldn't be watching, maybe, say, a Sunday morning, so that the Asian audience and other people who wanted to watch would get into those films. We tried to get the most popular films of Indian cinema from the past so as to recreate, what had been in the culture. Then I thought that let's pause here and make a history of Indian cinema. So Mahmood Jamal as the producer and Lawrence Posma as the director. Lawrence, of course, knew where to focus the camera, while Mahmood was thinking out the process with me, of course, what the philosophy of the film would be. And I told him there are thousands of people in the Indian film industry, get at least 100 of them onto screen. So he probably interviewed about 90 to 100 people, directors, producers, actors, singers, dancers, music writers, set designers, all sorts. He went and interviewed the most important people, I think, in Indian cinema. And it was a fantastic task. It lasted months. They had a lot of fun. They had a lot of fights. They met a lot of people. And they came back to Britain with stacks of this stuff. And I said, okay, we've got to distill this into 4 hours. So let's think theoretically about what the history of Indian cinema, the ideas behind Indian cinema, its progress, the influences that came into it, the distinctions that one can make between one kind of Indian cinema and another. And so they put together that, and it became the 4-part transmitted at prime time on Channel 4 called the Peacock Screen. And of course, now your university, de Montfort, has all the outtakes, which are much longer than the 4 hours that we transmitted on Channel 4.
Yes, absolutely. You mentioned something that the collection has. I call it the collection because to me that is a collection. Being a film historian, I'm just very excited about calling it a collection. It's beautiful because there are really testimonies of from names like, and we are going to watch a few extracts from the Peacock Screen, but from P.K. Nair, from Jairaj, Shekhar Kapoor, Mrinal Sen, just to Nadia. I'm a huge fan of Nadia, of course, and she absolutely she made a hell on screen. So and so many more. There are so many names that really need to be that are included. And so I find his work incredibly important. There is something that I read about the Peacock Screen, which says that the Peacock Screen is the first reappraisal of Hindi cinema, which I find it very interesting, Farrukh. And of course, Ahmed, I like to know what were the kind of discussion that were going on at home on this project as well, because we would like to know some of the history, let's say, that supported then the creative production of this work.
Well, if I can just say quickly, then hand over to the guru himself, Mr. Farrukh. We were the first Asian workshop amongst Black or Asians.
Yeah.
One of the remits of the workshop, which was franchised by Channel 4 and GLC and local authorities, was also to help and train other people. And one of the courses we ran was on the history of Indian cinema. And I think we organized some of the courses at our own studio, and some of them were at the London Film School where I graduated. And I think Mahmood spoke on one or two occasions on that, and his interest grew a lot more in the history of Indian cinema. He had come much earlier than me in the 60s to to London to study, uh, and then he came into he started writing poetry and things like that. But I think after the courses, he pretty well knew all that. And we had people who were coming giving us lectures on different aspects of cinema, and some of the things that we were told enlightened us, because we used to think of Bollywood films or Indian film cinema as a formulaic kind of song and dance number with all that. And then there were people who like we had this big lecture on Pakiza, which we were told that it stopped filming for 17 years and then recontinued, Kamal Amroi's film, and things like that. And I think Mahmood himself, being a poet, and he was so well versed in Urdu poetry, and so many of the poets were in the thing. So one of the great incentives, when obviously in discussion with Farrukh, when the opportunity came up, he reveled in it, and he loved the trip to India, particularly talking to poets. And I think Farrukh will say more. So I just want to also say I'm a stand-in because my brother passed away, and so I've been asked by Farrukh and Manya to say what I little bit I know, but I shall try and contribute as much as I can and try and provoke Farrukh a little bit.
Oh yes, that's one of the aim of the evening. Farrukh, so so we said so the Peacock Screen was trying to make was one of the first reappraisal of indie cinema. So what was trying to reappraise?
What happens in the historical documents about Indian cinema is people write biographies which are really hagiographies. They don't really critically look at what is the cinema doing in the context of Indian society, in the context of Indian history, in the context of Indian creativity, in the context of the Indian imagination, if there is such a unified thing. Now, what they do is they say, oh, that was the greatest film, and then he moved on to do that, then he moved on to do that, then he did that, and then he created this wonderful film, and every film is wonderful and every film is the best. If you read the biographies, and you can read the biographies of several people, even the history of cinema, I've read about 2 or 3 of them, just do exactly that. Then came this, then came that, then came that. There was no critical attempt to relate cinema to society, to political events, to the progress of the Indian subcontinent. And the Peacock Screen, of course, there must have been bits and pieces here and there in academia and possibly in writing to do that. But for the first time, I think we tried to bring together, without reference to anybody else, without reference to any other biographers, an analytical look at what Indian cinema was doing. So it's not just a concatenation of interviews. It, in fact, tries to develop a thesis or several theses within that history. Where did it start? What inspired it? What its relationship was to the politics, the economics, to the poverty, the imagination, the artistic creativity of the time. And of course, there are branches of Indian cinema. We never started calling it Bollywood until the 80s or 90s, I think. That was when people formulated the word Bollywood. We used to call it Hindi cinema, Hindi pictures. And they weren't just Hindi pictures, they were Bengali pictures also. And there were Tamil pictures and Telugu pictures and Malayali pictures, and Punjabi ones. So we tried to get those strands together, concentrating on the 2 big strands, popular cinema and art cinema.
That's perfect. Thank you for saying that, Farrukh, because I just want to make a very small point. I think that the work of Mahmoud is, from a researcher point of view, is exceptional because we love doing interviews, which is where we get actually the best, the most, the juicy bit of our research comes always from kind of a sociological approach, if you want. So those interviews are actually quite revealing, and I love to share a little bit this evening with a few clips where we are going to try and unpack a little bit how this reappraisal of Hindi cinema was taking place. So if we are all happy, we can play our first video.
I am an actor. I started acting in the year 1929 in the silent films. I kept a diary of my work, and now I'll take you on a little journey. This is my diary, my work. My first film was called Sparkling Youth. We used to have English titles for our pictures. It was an outdoor film made entirely on location, and it proved to be a success. I did about 11 silent films. The first camera I faced was a camera which was wooden and hand cranked, and even the magazines were wooden in there. And we did mostly social films and action films, and they were very popular. The number of theaters were less then, and when a silent film was projected, we had a commentator and a music, just a couple of musicians faking, you see, horse hooves and then fighting and things like that with a harmonium, as we call it, and a couple of drums. That used to be the background score for our silent films.
When I came into the film industry, it was a very different atmosphere altogether. To begin with, there were really no studios. There were little sheds here and there, and people worked in sunlight sometimes. And the whole thing was so absolutely, really uncomfortable. There were no dressing rooms, there were no sitting rooms, there was no canteen, there was nothing at all, no conditions of real conducive to making a good work or a good film or anything to that extent. We had a very difficult time because at that time, films were considered one of the lowest things of raga, of art. People never considered it as an art. They just thought it was a mamu jumbo of some sort, and that was that. So I think at that stage, when film had no real standing or dignity, or even the stability of a good financial background.
Although the fledgling industry remained a male preserve even as early as the silent era, a few women like Lalita Power tentatively began their careers.
मुश्किल तो औरतों को नहीं होता था, लेकिन मानते ही नहीं थे लोग. जैसे कि आपने देखा है नट लोग वगैरह होते, कोई रस्सी के ऊपर वैसे नाचते, नट नटनियाँ. इनमें उन आर्टिस्टों को गिना जाता था फिल्म के, या तमाशा होता था मराठी में. उस तरह का इज्जत ही नहीं थी कुछ. उन लोगों को ना तो मकान देते थे, ना बातचीत करते थे, ना फिल्म में कोई आदमी या औरतें आती नहीं थी. अगर फिल्म में काम करना हो औरत का, अगर समझ लीजिए कि कोई मॉब है और तो मर्द सब मॉब में चाहिए, तो औरतों को दाढ़ी मूछे लगाकर औरतें मर्द बना देते थे, या औरतें ज़्यादा चाहिए हो तो मर्दों को औरतों का मेकअप कर देते थे.
ये आपने देखा अपनी आंखों से?
देखा नहीं, किया है.
आपने मर्दों का भी रोल किया है?
किया है. दाढ़ी मूछे ऋषि वगैरह के रोल होते थे तो करना पड़ता था, क्योंकि परमानेंट जितने लोग थे वही काम करते थे और नहीं.
That's a lovely segment from the Peacock screen, where there are several things that have been addressed. Of course, the origins of cinema. I also have to say that there is a moment when we see the diary of Jairaj, which I would love to go there and look at his notes. It would have been so interesting. But really, very in a very soft way, there is a take of his notes and how his work and the way he was recording his work. But really, what I would like to talk about about this segment is about those artistic, those social and political concerns that Indian silent cinema, or rather Indian cinema, had from the very beginning. And on the second note, I really would like to know and talk a bit more about women in Indian cinema, especially from the very beginning.
Okay. I think Indian cinema began with some people, intellectuals, experimenting with this new um, this new technology. They were experimenting with the cameras, and they didn't actually think of themes. One of the first movies ever made, let's say turn of the century, right? 2, 3 years before, 2, 3 years after it began. One of the first things made was some fantasy on Aladdin, right? Which came from the Arabian Nights and so on, and it was just an experiment to try and see how this new moving picture thing worked with the cameras and the editing and so on. Then came the idea that this was an instrument that could be used for what was going on politically in India, which was the nationalist movement. There was the idea that Indians should govern themselves. And obviously, part of that thrust, say we can govern ourselves, is to say we are rich in culture, we are rich in intellect, we are capable of governing ourselves just as you in your Christian countries are. So if you have, Jesus Christ and King Arthur in your movies, we have Raja Harishchandra from the Mahabharata, right? We can do the Ramayana, we can do the Mahabharata, and Raja Harishchandra was one of the first big movies to hit the Indian screen. And it was in line with this kind of nationalist pride to say, here we are, right? You could see from the clips that we saw, Durga Kote's young film, the silent films, that they weren't really outdoor sets. They weren't realistic. They were stage sets with cardboard pillars, painted to look like palaces. In the one that Jairaj was in, right, you have the mythological division between good and evil. So there is a young man with an Arab turban, for God's sake. I don't know why he's an Arab, but other people facing him who are also some kind of royalty. But there would be in that movie good and bad very, very clearly distinguished. No gray areas. The hero is the hero, the villain is the villain. And they played like that. In the silent movies, the villains had their eyebrows raised and colored black and so forth. And the heroes wore lipstick. And, it was that kind of puppetry, if you like, of good and evil. And it all came from the two great myths, from the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. So those informed Indian theater right to the end, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that there are still references to the main theme. But I really like what you said about the nationalist kind of aspect of those films, especially when they address mythological stories. And I find them when I think about them, when I teach silent cinema to my students, I always mention the work of Palke as a kind of an early example of silent cinema and its early social approach, if you want, because from the very beginning, I think that we have a sense of how I always see it in a way that Palke was trying to demonstrate, or rather not to demonstrate, but rather to build an identity for India that was, of course, in a very delicate and difficult, if you want, historical moment. I think that's yeah, like you said, I think that from the beginning, silent cinema had a very strong social kind of and political responsibilities. What happened to women?
But all
Yeah,
these
sorry,
stories, before we got to women, all these stories were also being performed in folk, in folk theater, in villages. They were all religious mythology. So for him to go into that was a natural progression. That let's tell
Yeah.
these our mythology now on film. So all the makeup and a lot of the things existed in the kind of theatrical performances.
Yeah, and that's very true. And kind of it proves the point that it was very much about kind of reappropriating, if you want, of that specific
Yeah.
language to, to establish a solid identity. Absolutely, that's an excellent point. Just final point: women. What happened to women in Indian cinema in the silent era?
Alu.
Well, I think if I remember correctly, there was some. I mean, basically, women were seen as the mother and the person who looks after the family, and that kind of, and the good women represented good. There were some women who were villain, but I think Shantaram did an earlier film, if I'm Dunya Na Mane, in which a young girl is married to an older man. And for that time, it was quite a thing. And then she convinces him that this is wrong in the film. I don't know if you know that film, in which then he then ends up realizing that he's wrong, but he kills himself. Yeah. So they couldn't go that far. But in the end, this message is she's a widow, and that's not.
The other thing to say is that in the silent movie era, in the 20s, 30s, 40s, there arose the idea of the Gandhian ideology. And Gandhi's influence over the whole of India was absolutely stupendous. And his ideas were social reform ideas. There should be no caste, right? India was riddled with caste, possibly still is. But what he was saying was, let's abolish caste. And he called them the lower caste people of God. They resented that as patronizing nowadays. But his move was to abolish the idea of caste. And cinema took it up and made a movie about a little girl called Achut Kanya, untouchable girl, right? So from there began a feminist movement, if you like. And that too was Gandhi's idea, that there should be no distinction between the gender citizenship of India. And so other movies were made extolling the role of women. For instance, Razia Begum was one of the first queens of Muslim India, of the Sultanate of India. And that was made her the heroine. So they placed women at the center of films, of the stories, even though, as both actresses that we saw in the clip said, we had no facilities, we were treated a little better than courtesans, street dancers, and people who on the fringes of society. We weren't respectable in that sense, and we had to act. We weren't as artists.
But cinema, like in Hollywood, has been exploitative of women, it's been misogynistic, and the treatment of women in a lot of the films, the main big films, even now, continuing from that time, at least they were a bit more subtle before, has been, not something you admire. It's those films that we mentioned that are few and far between. Most of them were exploitative. Even in later on, the idea of getting a woman wet, in every film there'll be a water somewhere, a fountain, and she'll get, because the clothes will stick to the body. So it's not something one should be proud of, particularly the depiction of women. But I would say that about Hollywood in the beginning, that's true of cinema. Cinema has used sex as a way of selling itself, and
I think it's an important point to make, the one of women, because of course at the beginning they were actually there were a few, and those few were often, we talked about that, like marginalized, if you want, by society, by the family itself. But then the actual representation of women did not or rather, we had different type of representation of women or categories, and some of them have not been, I'd say in inverted comma, updated, if you want. So there has been a certain exploitation of the body of women, and so those yellow saris have done hell on screen. So those wet yellow saris, there is like well, we know that how some particularly mainstream cinema has been using women in a certain way. But I think it was important to make a point, especially with the interviews to Durga Chote and Lalita Pawar. It was important to kind of make a point about how women are, or how they were, there at the very beginning of cinema, and what role did they have within the overall growing industry. I would keep talking about this on and on, because it's a very interesting topic, but I would like to indulge in a second clip where we're going to touch and move on in history and look at, again, a very important moment in the history of Indian cinema. If we can play the second video, that would be fantastic. Thank you.
A starkly socialist message not often encountered in Indian cinema.
Ma, roti.
You go back to early 40s to Mehboob Khan's films, one of the most socially conscious directors. Those are landmark films, Roti, Bread, and Aurat, the woman. The scenes from these two films are being duplicated today. So yesterday's films might contain a tribute to these two films. Roti was about a symbolic film influenced by German Expressionism about the takeover of a society by a despot, by an economic tyrant.
Another crucial issue which would lead to partition and which still plagues Indian society was Hindu-Muslim relations. Director V. Shantaram explored this theme in a film called Parosi, an impassioned plea for unity. Interestingly enough, the Muslim role in Parosi was played by a Hindu, the Hindu by a Muslim.
आप मुझे छोड़ना चाहते हो? अब नहीं छोड़ूंगा ठाकुर। अब हम हमेशा के लिए पड़ोसी हो गए। दुनिया छूट जाएगी, जिंदगी छूट जाएगी, ये पड़ोस नहीं छूटेगा।
Indian cinema in the early 40s passed through its really glorious period. It was called the Golden Era. And we didn't not only had very successful films, we also had very good films of very high quality. Talking only of box office, we had three of the biggest commercial hits in that period: Kismat, Ram Rajya, and Shakuntala. And these films ran and ran. You know, they didn't run in terms of weeks or months, they ran for years. Kismat ran for 4 years, and so on. Now, this, I think, was due to the devotion of the filmmakers, basically to the medium itself. They were not so conscious of the box office, they were not all the time thinking whether the film will run or not. And the speculative aspect was not there. the audience was really entertained as well as treated to some high caliber cinema of different types.
There was also a small group of people who were very anxious to make realistic films. Films like Hum Log, Footpath, and some others were in comparison minor films. Now these films, they in a way, the pioneering efforts for a realistic kind of cinema.
Thank you. Thank you so much for running this video. So there is a lot to say about there are multiple themes that we need another hour for this, but we have the 40s, early 50s again, that they are a very important moment in the history of Indian cinema. And there are very interesting interviews that are included there, because I just want to keep going back to the importance of the document that we have in the Peacock screen, which are those interviews with Ran Gonvala, for instance, historian, Garga, again, huge historian as well. So their kind of contribute is unbelievable. So in those films, we have questions such as partition, class, and whatnot. So what happens with Vishantaram, for instance, which is who is a very interesting was a very interesting filmmaker, and with Mehboob. So where is this socialist message, or rather, how is this socialist message coming out in a very, if you want, in a different way from their work?
See, you can see exactly what Shantaram was doing. In the clips that we have seen and in all the other films, you can see that poverty and exploitation is something that you have to fight if you are doing Indian cinema. Also, the film about partition, and of course, he takes the dramatic narrative line of a Hindu and a Muslim being friends to the end and dying together, right? Because of the tragic conflict that is going on. There shouldn't be a separation. Here you are together, you're blowing up together, right? Now, I don't know what Mr. Garga was thinking of. I don't know what kind of spectacles he was wearing, because he said, this is all realistic. Every inch of the film that we saw, every costume, every set is the height of stylization. There's no reality in it at all. India doesn't look like that. Nobody dresses like that. Nobody carries, a stick that comes out and pokes at another fellow who hasn't seen him coming round the corner. It's all theatrical stylization. So also with Shantaram's dam busting scene, it's complete stylization in the mode of, as the critic said, German expressionism, right? So they take those images and they mold them into Indian cinema, into a nationalistic and reformist message. And the reformist message becomes severe. It deals with death and tragedy and explosiveness. But there is not one jot of realism in it. It's all stylized. It's as stylized as Picasso, as different as Picasso is from a photograph of a lady.
I agree. I mean, absolutely, I agree with you, Farrukh. I think that there is also something else I wanted to add. I think that Indian cinema, and that is actually a pretty good example. It's international from the very beginning. Like the borrowing, if you want, from international cinema and from the visual grammar of, for instance, German expressionism makes those films not only appealing to a local audience for the theme, of course, that they treat, but also to an international audience. And a lot of these films also started slowly traveling from 1946, if I'm not wrong. They start traveling abroad. No, rather earlier than that, 1937. We have one of the first Indian films traveling abroad to film festivals. So the actual language starts becoming very international in their nature as well, which I think it is quite quite important. I think the point Garga was making to the realism was to what we have then later on. Sorry, I have to say something about our lovely Garga, because I've been reading a lot of his work, and
Because that clip was much later. That was in the
yes,
60s, yeah. So
yes.
and
So
that
he kind of
after being influenced by Italian Neorealism and Bicycle Thieves and all that. Sorry, go on.
Why does he call it realistic?
There is a more realistic approach.
It's realism in the sense it's city, it's urban, that kind of thing. And
That's hardly realistic, my dear. Realistic means what you can actually see with your eyes, what you can take with a photograph.
You don't see
not the extreme stylization that we've seen in every shot.
You don't see a crime being committed. This is depicting a crime. It's depicting.
My dear, you know how crimes are committed. They are
no,
not
but you don't see it. So you just show you.
They are not committed with a villain's face being on camera. Come on, grow up.
Well, anyway, that was actually a clip that was going to lead us to the final clip, because this discussion about realism and what is real and what is not, and how do we tell story, what is the valid way of saying that, is actually one of the hot topic that we have been discussing, I have to say, in the past months. I know that who is following us perhaps is not familiar or is not aware about the fact that we have been talking about, and we have been having these debates much before this evening. But in that light, I would like to show everyone our final clip, where again this debate is emerging. Can we have the third clip? Thank you.
80% of our audiences look at mainstream cinema as a part of our culture, and they derive it as their own culture. So it reaffirms their moralities. It reaffirms the way they see life.
You see, we in India are simultaneously living in various levels of reality. So from mythology to science fiction is the entire spectrum of our experience today. And this is what has to come out when we make films.
India, I'm told, is the largest film producing country. India makes about 800 films in a year, but it is not with any sense of satisfaction or sense of pride that I say it. Most of the Indian films are made either in Bombay or in the East or in the South are no better than just garbage. That's
But our intellectuals, so-called pseudo-intellectuals, Hindi cinema, what rubbish. But it was that rubbish. This statement has come from that rubbish. And therefore, it is high time that we start taking our escapist cinema seriously. It is making statements.
To start with, when you talk about such social issues, the intention is all very good, but the way the whole thing is handled, that I think is much too childish. This is what I find. Much too melodramatic, and doesn't have much of substance in it, in such things. This is what I feel. But in the total sense, a complete film was made not before 1955, when a young batch of outsiders, they made an aggressive infiltration into cinema and made a film which enthralled the country and shook the world. That was Pather Panchali.
In the West, the only thing that comes very close is probably what is still left is the opera. You know, in the opera you have elements like this, and you also make use of melodrama. You also take pleasure in telling a story, you know, all these things. Now, the Indian cinematic form allows you to do all these wonderful things. You can get in, you can explore musical idioms, you can tell stories, you can deal with the contemporary issues, you can take them on any level you choose. You know, you can allow your imagination to grow, you know. It doesn't have to be restrictive. It's restrictive only when you become imitative.
So I put together this final clip because I know that would be the hot topic: realism and the work of art cinema versus mainstream cinema, broadly speaking. So just some comments really about where are we now with those two languages? So where are we with telling realistic stories or not, and what the audience wants? How is Indian cinema changing in light of those two huge this huge divide?
Well, in Indian cinema derives from two different influences, if you like. The main cinema comes, even though it has completely changed the scenes, completely changed the era, it comes from the mythologies that I've earlier referred to. And Indian cinema, as Alu remarked, right, in those mythologies, copies or takes from, derives from the religious festivals and the theatrical stuff that went on in Ram Leela and the Diwali and the holy ceremonies that feature drama, even throughout the villages, from Punjab down to Kanyakumari. You have those religious festivals with theatricals in them. And from those theatricals, they're all about mythology, always about mythology. And you take, there might be variations in that mythology, but from that, you take the spirit of it and you turn it into mythological films. And that's what Hollywood cinema, the mainstream of cinema, is. That's where it comes from. Yeah. On the other hand, in Bengal, for instance, when Mrinal Sen says Pathar Panchali was the first film to change things, it was because in Bengal, there was an imitation of the novelistic tradition of the West. The novel was born in Europe. The novel was born in the European languages when people started questioning the morality of religion. Mm-hmm. So when you have Madame Bovary and Anna Karenina and Middlemarch and people committing adultery there, they're not saying, listen to God, as the earlier books were saying. They're saying, let us look at how human beings really behave. And that's tradition of the novelisms came into Bengal. And when the Bengalis started writing novels, people adapted those novels into the films. So when you have Satyajit Ray and Mrinal Sen, and even Ritwik Ghatak to an extent working at realistic cinema, you get a different strand of cinema branching out. Then there are people like Shyam Benegal, whom we saw in that clip, right? Shyam Benegal is a great filmmaker, but he makes what we call art films. And the art films were sometimes very socialistic minded, insofar as, they took up some cause in a village and said, look, the weavers are being starved of their income. I'm going to make a movie about weavers being starved of their income, right? The mainstream of Indian peasantry and whatnot don't want to watch that. They want cinema as Shekhar and Ketan Mehta, both of whom I've worked with, right? As they were saying in that clip, that Indian cinema exists as a dimension of the imagination in the Indian subcontinent. It is part of the mythology that we all carry in our heads. And that's what we want to see. Some people call it escapism. Some people call it the great dimension of the imagination in which a pictorial idea of India, not the reality, lives. There is the Indian subcontinent as it exists with all its cruelties and injustices, and there is this ideal land in which heroes vanquish villains, and the truth triumphs.
Yeah, I think that there was the actual very final sentence of Shyam Benegal was actually very inspiring, because on one side we have some fervent believer that Indian cinema should be the mainstream way. Other, of course, like Mrinal Sen, that have been masters in making film that were moving completely away from that very popular type of language. Yeah, same, Satyajit Ray and so on. But actually, Sean Benegal says something very beautiful, I think, that kind of moves away from both views. That goes back to what you said about the dimension of the imagination, and that is to not put any boundaries to that imagination. So there are some of us that can imagine and see the world in a more, say, realistic way or not. So it was just a very beautiful way to kind of celebrate really the multiple ways in which stories are told in Indian cinema. Sorry, Ahmed,
I was just going to say, as filmmakers, they saw that a lot of Bombay films, mainstream films, were very all fantasy and escapism, and some of the filmmakers like Ray and Sen and all, and Ritik Ghatok and people like that came up and they said, look, cinema can serve another purpose, like neorealism did, or later on Nouvelle Vague in France. That cinema can talk about things and subjects and people that these big films were not doing in the mainstream cinema at that time in India. They were usually the films were middle class or rich people, their lives being depicted more and more. So these people said, and they saw the trends in other parts of the world, and it's changed. Even now, what's interesting is Hollywood is making a lot of films that the French filmmakers in the 60s made, or the Italians made. They're making very difficult films. So apart from this mainstream cinema, something has come out. And we're sort of missing that in India, in the sense that although now there may be a convergence of some form, and I think that restriction, as I was saying, I think the other day, of Indian cinema being trapped in that formula of song and dance and fantasy, so it doesn't translate too much to the other cultures. So if you take an example, say Iranian cinema. Iranian cinema, if you go to a cinema in the West, you'll see a lot more non-Iranians watching the film. Whereas if you go to an Indian film now, in any of the big centers like New York or London, 99% of the audience is of Asian descent, Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi. So this is a problem that I think that they've got trapped into that because they spend so much money in doing those films that there should have been some kind of conversion. Although parallel cinema or the independent or the art cinema in India is completely decimated right now, I think.
I think that, Ahmed, I agree with what you say, but I also have to mention that there is a huge re-emergence of what we call independent kind of Indian cinema from all over India. And I think there are incredibly interesting new productions that are circulating across the world. And in tandem with that, there are so many film festivals that are actually dedicated just to this new emerging Indian cinema, which is really trying to move away from that kind of formula, that we know. And I think that this if you want this balance between the two, between the huge divide, as I called it, it's actually slowly happening now, and it is very refreshing to see how those two traditions, if you want, they're trying to slowly work together. If you agree, before we actually say goodbye to each other, I have a couple of questions that I would like to ask you, and they come from our audience. So I have questions about again influences of Western cinema. And the question states, what parts of Western cinema do you think has been inspired from Indian cinema, and do you like it? Has it done Indian cinema justice? And that comes from Anna.
Well, as far as I can see, the influence has always been the other way around. So if you watch Indian song and dance in popular cinema, it is always taken from some hip hop choreography, even though the costumes are Indian rural, 1,000 girls in saris carrying water pots and dancing. They still follow the choreography of some Western dance steps. The entire sets and the concept of the group dance has come together not through Indian classical traditions, but through the West. Now, I've never seen a Western film that has been influenced, except
No,
one.
no, Baz Luhrmann, the director who made
Yes.
Moulin Rouge and
Moulin
Romeo and
Moulin Rouge,
Juliet, he said that so if you look at the art direction and the and the kind of the way he's treated, let's say Shakespeare and Romeo.
That's exactly the only thing I was thinking. The only film I was thinking of was Moulin Rouge.
So he has said that
that's right. But I can't think of another. So, and I don't know.
Mostly the other way around.
Unequipped to answer the question.
I think that there is again a good mix of the tradition coming together and the tradition from the West. It's never just one single thing. I think that there is always a good marriage between traditions. Farrukh.
Let me say, I used to go in my days as commissioning editor to Cannes and to the Cannes Film Festival. And at Cannes, a film like Salam Bombay won the director's prize, right?
Yeah.
It won the golden prize for the first director. Now, at Cannes, one would meet all sorts of Bollywood people. And they would say in the Indian newspapers, my films are at Cannes. What they meant was they had hired some cinema to show some rubbish that they had produced, and not that they had been chosen for the festival itself. And they weren't in the festival at all, but they would say, my film is at Cannes. Of course, that's literally true, because they'd hired a cinema in which they put it on and invited some guests. But no Bollywood film has ever reached that kind of festival. Whereas Salam Bombay, Bandit Queen, both of which I wrote Bandit Queen, but Salam Bombay was my commission, and those sorts of films have reached Cannes and will continue to so do. As you said, the new independent cinema is going there. But Bollywood,
Okay. But the point was the language of the language of Salam Bombay was totally Western, because the director was trained and worked in the West.
But you mean the cinematic language or the speech? The speech was Hindi.
Oh no, the cinematic language was.
I'm talking about the cinematic language, the way it was handled, the way it was shown, with realism and things like that.
He made fun of Indian cinema there too. There were a couple of scenes which were satirical against Bollywood. In Salam Bombay.
I have a very final question for actually both of you, which is a lovely question, and I can't answer to that. I'm sure you're the best to answer. The question asked, do you think there is anyone in the film industry now that could rival Mahmood Jamal's legacy?
Well, I think if there is anyone who can continue it and wants to continue it, it would be his brother, Ahmad Jamal, sitting right there. But what happened with Mahmood is that maybe multicultural programming, filming, began with the mission to complain, right? Oh, we are victims, we are victimized, this is this is that. You can see a bit of that even today emerging in the films that are being so broadly encouraged and viewed, the Steve McQueen series, in which every act against the blacks, right, against black people in this country is being showcased. Mahmood didn't do that. He resolved, as his career progressed, that the mission to complain is dead. the mission to be part of Britain with our own culture is alive. And that's what he brought to the screen. And I hope somebody will continue that mission, right? But that's, I think, Mahmood's central legacy. There was a program that he brought to me, which was about 6 new British Asian music groups. I called it irreverently Band Baja, but all those 6, right? All the people in those first forays into television have now become big stars. Mr. Soni, Tanveen Singh, they become percussionists and names, and they earn money doing what they do. But they started with Mahmood's program, Band Baja.
Yeah.
I think part of the problem is that the opportunity that were there when there was a multicultural commissioning editor at Channel 4, and also there was somebody at the BBC, that is no longer there. So there's been, since Farrukh left the channel up to now with the Black Now movement, there's been a complete decimation of the independent Black and Asian sections, producers. There was, under Farrukh, there were like 40 or 50 companies, if I'm not mistaken. They've all gone.
Yes.
There are only a few left. So unless the opportunity and the commissioning is not there, there'll be nobody to carry on that, because there was a belief that we don't need a multicultural department. There's all those programs are being commissioned by all mainstream departments, and it didn't happen. And that's why suddenly they realized that there's a big shortage of people in the film industry in all sorts of departments. So hopefully the current situation is that there will be people coming out and doing the kind of things that Farrukh is talking about, which will encourage people from Asian background to play a bigger role.
Yeah.
I
think that's, sorry.
When you don't have people from the communities commissioning stuff, or approving or editing stuff, what you get is a woke consciousness which stays away from, for instance, portraying any negative thing about Blacks and Asians. They want it all to be positive images. I mean, if you want positive images, go to Saatchi and Saatchi and get them to advertise you. Don't attempt drama and cinema.
Yeah. Can I I just want to thank you both, just because we are running out of time. I just want to say that I had the honor to work with Mahmood and to have very interesting chat where Farrukh was there as well, and the pleasure I had in seeing them chatting was something that is unique. However, I also have to say that he was a very sensitive artist, a very perceptive critic, and to me was a very, I would say, a wise teacher. So it was truly beautiful to talk about the legacy of his work and actually what this is going to do for many communities, many researchers, for a lot of us, really, by being able to have access to his fantastic work. So I would like to thank Ahmed and Farrukh, and I would like to thank everyone. And please, unfortunately, we can't answer all the questions, but I will be leaving my email at the end. So feel free to please mail me should you have any questions, and I can then pass it to Farrukh and Ahmed. Thank you very much, everyone. And I wish you a nice evening ahead. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
Bye.